Well, first of all, I just want to thank Paul, Harold, for your invitation to present at Grand Rounds today. It's a huge honor to be there. I certainly hope next time we're together next time we have the opportunity to talk about these areas, it'll be in person, either up in Baltimore, down here in Atlanta, or otherwise. And I also look forward to having the opportunity to discuss around this topic and really, talking about registries around the context of some of these technologies and capabilities noted here, raises some interesting questions. And I hope over the course of this talk, will prompt some discussion about where we've been, where we are, and where we can go. I do want to note that I do not have any disclosures to this talk today, but I do want to disclose more specifically the reason that I have decided to talk about registries today. So as you can hear from some of the work I've done and looking at a lot of the other areas, I focused a lot of my time around areas such as drug safety and analytics. And I teach a course to seniors in college, but primarily master's students in health informatics. And I can tell you that the things that get students, pulses pounding, a flutter, typically are not things like registries. They're interested in the machine learning, predictive modeling. They're interested in natural language processing. They're interested in clinical decision support, data visualization, the interesting applications in different clinical domains. But I would say not too many students have come to me and said, Dr. Duke, my dream is to really explore registries from a career perspective. But at the same time, I would make the case, and certainly it has been what I've observed over the course of my career, that registries do have a very central place in informatics. And I think that the reason in many ways is that regardless of what areas you're exploring, whether it's a public health, which is where I spend a lot of my time these days working with CDC and other public health collaborators, working with FDA, or whether it's for clinical research, whether it's for clinical care, whether it's looking at cost, utilization, registries occupy a huge amount of activity and are very fundamental because they're a sort of a simple notion, broadly speaking. And the way that I kind of think about a registry is a collection of information about individuals over time. And they can be manyfold in how that's represented, but it's a pretty basic kind of informatics notion. So that whatever you may be getting yourself into with research or other activities, this kind of need is quite common. And if you look at sort of the definitions for registries, and this is one from HRQ in 2013, and it's probably the most sort of generally classically broad. It describes a patient registry as a collection for one or more purposes of standardized information about a group of patients who share a condition or experience. And going forward, sort of there have been a variety of different ways to express this, but the definitions are always broad in this regard. They kind of say, well, we're gathering data, we might use it for a lot of different things, and ultimately why we're getting it can be applied in many different directions. But I'll give a few examples, just for those that may not spend a lot of time thinking about registries writ large. They may be looking at, for example, individuals who've had a particular event. So trauma, a registry is quite a common use case. They might be looking at individuals who've had a particular procedure. So, for example, a shoulder surgery and arthroplasty, and they're following up to see how an individual did. Individuals who've had a condition of public health importance. So COVID is, of course, the big one. You may recall just before COVID, there was EVALI, or e-vaping associated lung injury, which kind of got a little bit kind of swept away by the largeness of COVID, but was a pretty big deal in an area that they were trying to track very carefully. You might also find registries looking at individuals who could be eligible for a study or have received a particular device, such as a knee replacement, such as a pacemaker, or individuals who may be at risk in a population, neonates or other individuals who there's importance in following that group from the shared experience perspective. And in terms of applications, again, so many. I mean, truly, I don't want to use the word infinite, but certainly myriad is a fair word to say, whether it's quality improvement, clinical research, cost effectiveness, treatment effectiveness, surveillance for safety of drugs, devices, public health. accreditation. The list goes on quite long for how a registry might be applied. And I think that describes quite justly why there's over 100 plus at Hopkins, why 70 FTE worth of individuals doing this. There's so many reasons and use cases that can be explored. So registries, hopefully I've at least made a case that whatever you might be interested in informatics, there's something that comes back to that fundamental piece of how we can most effectively capture data in a standardized way more efficiently, and that registries is actually a really central and critical challenge for informatics to address, which of course informatics has been doing for a long time. I would be more than remiss in not stating full on that informatics has embraced, since its origins, medical informatics has embraced registries and how to make them better. Certainly for many people, something like REDCap is almost synonymous with the idea of a registry. And that's an incredible application and platform which has enabled so many registries to be developed and expanded upon. And there's other neat things that we'll cover about what they've done since then. You've got a sort of standardized data models and querying tools like I2B2 or increasingly with OMOP and Odyssey, where people identify a cohort through a simple query, and then they're able to sort of begin building a registry with a head start from a group of patients that's been identified through these kinds of tools. And then, of course, informatics has a huge hand in some of these major programs, like All of Us, like N3C, where these are registries, additional information involved, brought in, but informatics is a front and center role in these kind of significant programs. And so informatics has done a tremendous amount, but still, as Paul alluded to, lots of people spending lots of time building registries. And this might explain some of the reasons why. So the American College of Surgeons has a trauma registry where they require for accreditation that you have at least half an FTE for every 200 to 300 patients in a registry per year. And that you can see here that the majority of health systems might have over 2 or 3 staff just working on, for example, their trauma registry in order to meet the accreditation requirements. So there's a lot of people and there's a lot of jobs out there for clinical data abstractors. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all doing work around registries, but certainly the notion of needing to go in, pull data out in a standardized and structured way, there's a big demand, a lot of job opportunities, and sort of reflects the fact that we've done a lot, but we haven't totally solved it. There's a lot of innovation, of course, that's happening all the time to try to address this concern. That abstraction, registry creation often is a significantly manual process. So you can see an example research form from 1993, and other than the font or the type, it looks kind of like something you might see today. There's some questions, someone has to circle or check a box, and it looks not dissimilar to what we might have for a form for public health, such as the COVID form in 2020, where they go through and check the boxes. There's lots of people in informatics, again, continuing to work on this challenge and to innovate around the manual abstraction of resources involved. I mentioned REDCap before, I'll mention it again, but they've stayed on the ball. They say, well, let's connect to FHIR, which we'll talk more about in a second, to bring in data in a more automated way with clinical data interoperability. So it's not all manual entry of data. A lot of great work in using text, using NLP to pull data from unstructured parts of the chart to fill out registries, whether around quality, whether in this example around HSV. So it's something that is actively being pursued across the field. And it's, to be honest, if we must be, has been pursued for a long time. And you can see Bill Hirsch, doing work back in 1998 at MedInfo, where he talked about trauma registry procedure codes being automatically predicted from ER dictations. And all along the way, over the past multiple decades, we've had work in this area, working towards registries, trying to innovate, trying to make things more efficient. So while we have much to do, while a lot has been done, I think it's always important in informatics, and I hope throughout your career, that you'll take the time sometimes to step back and look at the map and say, where are we? What's changed since I last took a good look at this map? And what are the things that maybe we can do today that we didn't realize and that we haven't done in the past because of those changes that we've seen. So today, the specific map that I want to focus on is one that deals with two different standards, FHIR and OMOP, as well as NLP as a technology, natural language processing. And I think this particular map has gotten particularly exciting over the past few years in the way that they've connected to each other and that they've really enabled some significant advances in registry creation and registry maintenance, and essentially in ways that we should be practicing when we design something new out of the gate. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do in informatics is to bring to the conversation, we're starting something new, how can we do it better? Or we're taking something that we've done right along and other opportunities to leverage some of these new capabilities. So I'd like to think about these different elements individually and then in connection, and then share how perhaps bringing them all together enables some pretty exciting possibilities going forward. So let me begin talking about FHIR. And I know this is as an informatics and a data science grand rounds. Most people probably know about FHIR here, but I don't want to take for granted the fact that everyone is as familiar. So just to say a few words about what FHIR is. So the acronym Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources reflects a set of technologies that enable the sharing of health data using a modern web protocols. So the two big pieces are a standard for describing health data formats and formats and elements, and those are called resources, and that's the standard part. And it's also an application programming interface, an API for exchanging electronic health data. And that's the piece that's sort of using modern web protocols to move data. If you want to get a little bit more concrete and say, well, okay, that's interesting, but what does FHIR look like? I mean, what do you mean? Here's sort of an example on either side of those two categories. So one is a resource, the condition resource, which is reflected over on the left side, and it has the kinds of things that you might imagine would be in place for a condition. So, for example, you might have a code and a code system like an ICD-10 code. You might have a date that it occurred, a date that it stopped. You may have a severity level. So these are the kinds of things that FHIR explicitly defines as being part of the condition resource. On the right side is what I guess you could say an API looks like, where you use these web-based protocols to request information in a particular way, such as in this case where it's looking for a particular condition, and the FHIR server returns the information that's expressed in that resource over on the left. So what's the code? What's the code system? Who's the subject? When did it start? That type of thing. So FHIR, while it doesn't sort of look like anything precisely, this is sort of an example of what it reflects. Now, the big difference, I think, in terms of the discussion we can have today is that I feel, and I hope this is the case, that in 2022, we no longer need to justify saying that FHIR is going to be a big deal. I'd say in 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, right along, we've had to have all the maps of, well, here's where FHIR is being adopted in EHRs, or this is why FHIR is really going to be something, and let's get excited about it. I feel at this point it's become closer to a fait accompli in the sense of FHIR is going to be adopted, but still, let's take just a moment to look back and have a bit of a refresher as to why we can make that statement with some confidence today. So FHIR began, and it's part of the HL7. You may be familiar with version 2, version 3 to some extent, but really FHIR kicked in 2011, but really 2014 was when the first version came out, and it's moved right along on version 4 now. There was a major event in FHIR's life in 2016 when the 21st Century Cures Act was passed, driving interoperability, and it was in a strongly bipartisan, which was maybe rare, to have such a strong statement around interoperability. But that was, in fact, what the case was. And so the need for interoperability was strongly advocated by the 21st Century Cures Act and then formalized, which we'll talk about in the final rule. And then also over the period of time since FHIR came out, the major health IT vendors, the big technology companies, the insurers, CMS, everybody has gotten behind FHIR. And so we've seen now the emergence, for example, of app stores in the vendor environments, We've seen on our phones, on all our phones, the ability to get health records, which are traveling behind the scenes via FHIR. And so it's sort of standard flowing through there. And we did see the Office of the National Coordinator on Health IT come out with their final rule saying that FHIR would be the standard by which health data would be moved. They also highlighted something very important called USCDI, or US Core Data for Interoperability, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But this final rule, which came out in May of 2020, really set the stakes for why I feel comfortable in 2022 saying, yeah, FHIR's here. It's the real deal, and we can say that with confidence. One of those reasons is that CMS has said, here's what we require for those who are participating through Medicare, Medicaid, which is patient access APIs, which is payer-to-payer data exchange, something that just came online last month. So there's a lot of weight behind these, and I think the particular piece that's interesting as a complement to FHIR, as I mentioned, is the US Core Data for Interoperability. What USCDI does is it says that this is the semantic, this is the content representation that needs to go inside the FHIR structure. So for example, if you have a clinical test, you should share it using LOINC. If you have problems, if you've got diagnoses, they need to be represented using SNOMED. If you're going to represent allergies, for example, those should be represented using RxNorm for substances, and reaction should be via SNOMED. So one of the really key elements is that we now have both semantic and syntactic standardization for EHR output. So why FHIR is a big deal for registries, and that includes, in particular, the regulatory requirements around FHIR, is that we now have confidence to say that EHR data could be extracted with a consistency, both syntactic and now, thank you to USCDI, a semantic standardization, which is a really big deal, a huge change to be able to say, well, when I request data in 2023, 2022 from an EHR, I should be able to expect it to come in a certain structure and format and in a certain content. It also, by standardizing these things, helps make the semantic representation of registry questions more clear. And I think that's a very significant piece of this as well. All right, well, let's talk for a moment about OMOP, which may be equally or slightly less familiar to folks. I think with Paul's activities, it's probably as familiar to everybody up there as FHIR. But just to share, what is OMOP and how does it get to stand on the same stage as something like FHIR? The acronym stands for the Observational Medical Outcomes Project, and it's a health data model for analytics. It's become widely adopted across a range of research, industry, government, and clinical entities. And you'll see in the right corner, I mentioned a community called Odyssey, which is sort of the body that oversees and coordinates the OMOP Common Data Model. And Odyssey, OHDSI, is a bit of an interesting acronym, maybe a stretch, but there's a lot of great Greek theming to many of the tools. And so Odyssey, if you ever see OHDSI, that's the pronunciation. Definitely not intuitive. The OMOP CDM started back in actually around 2008. The first version came out in 2009. I was fortunate to be just in the right hallway at Regenstrief when some folks were talking about this idea for OMOP, and have had the fortune of being involved since the beginning. But the data model has evolved significantly over the years to support a variety of different use cases and to be able to meet many of the needs of the community, including around registries. The OMOP Common Data Model is relatively simple compared to something like FHIR. There's some tables and some general schema around individuals, around information about people, around clinical sites. There's vocabulary information, but it's relatively controlled, relatively small in its definitions compared with something like FHIR. But that allows it to be integrated and adopted quite broadly. One of the most powerful aspects of OMOP is the OMOP vocabulary. The OMOP vocabulary is essentially a connection of a diverse range of vocabularies similar, and I should say strongly leveraging UMLS, but then adding to it many of the international vocabularies to enable folks from across the world to really leverage OMOP as a data model, thanks to those vocabulary connections that have been established. The Odyssey collaboration is really big and very exciting and very open. And anyone who is interested in learning more about it, certainly go to odyssey.org and check out all the things that are happening. But in addition to the collaborations as a whole, there's also a data network with over 300 databases that have been converted to the OMOP Common Data Model, and I think many more that may not have been officially registered, but have been put into OMOP framing. As you can see, it's in many countries. There's over 800 million unique patients that have been put into this data model. And again, I think that both reflected in the use at many academic medical centers, but increasingly a wide variety of organizations across the spectrum, academia, industry, government, other types of research organizations. OMOP has had a tremendous emergence reflected in publications, whether a few hundred, which is sort of the number of kind of official papers, or if you look at peer-reviewed publications, or if you look at where people have looked or used Odyssey for various white papers and analyses, there's probably just under a couple thousand different entries that will come up looking at Odyssey and OMOP. It's a very strongly active community. It's continued to grow significantly. OMOP has had a focus around registries since the very beginning because of the interest as researchers in these areas. And you can see things such as quality registry data analyses, looking at clinical data. Our REDCap friends are continuing to push things forward with REDCap to OMOP, sort of ETLing or transforming REDCap data into OMOP Common Data Model. There's a registry data to OMOP working group where much of the information about how do we make OMOP work for registry is advanced. There have been some studies looking at the use of OMOP as a common data model for registries. And I certainly want to avoid any notion of comparing one data model to another, although that is what this particular paper did. But in general, it's not a very productive discussion. But in this paper, they found a very substantial strength in OMOP in terms of its use for longitudinal registries. Whether that is explicitly the case or not, the proof in some sense is in the tasting, I guess, right? The proof of the pudding is in the tasting, which is that many of the major programs, like I mentioned before, All of Us and N3C, that have a very strong informatics hand, use OMOP as the back end for the registries and for the analyses component, the analytics components in particular. And so I think we've seen adoption, which is perhaps one of the strongest drivers of further adoption, is getting to a critical mass with adoption from some of these big types of programs. So why is OMOP a big deal for registries? Well, the emergence of a popular standard like OMOP being used by a wide breadth of registry creators for a wide variety of purposes, both in the US and internationally, provides sort of a first stop for consideration of a standardized registry format if someone's creating a new registry. So if you're building out a registry, you may want to take a look at OMOP and say, boy, a lot of people have been working on this. Might this work for what we're trying to do? But also you can take a look at how other registry efforts have extended OMOP to support their needs or transformed it. So it's not always the perfect fit, but many people are recognizing that the value of being able to do the analytics that are baked into OMOP and Odyssey make it worth figuring out a way to extend OMOP to meet those needs. So we've talked about FHIR and we've talked about OMOP, but our map really requires talking about the connection between FHIR and OMOP. And I'm happy to say that FHIR and OMOP are actually good friends. You might imagine they're both health data models. Maybe they're competitors. Should it be in a FHIR? Should it be in OMOP? But actually, there's quite strong collaboration, and it's been that case for some time for reasons that we'll discuss. Work that we've done at Georgia Tech, we have something called OMOP on FHIR. And OMOP on FHIR began in 2015, 2016. It goes back some ways, and it's really about connecting between FHIR and OMOP to make it easy for people to build applications that connect these two. Now, the rationale is a couple-fold. One is that it simplifies bridging between FHIR and OMOP data, yes, but also the application ecosystem. So we have Smart on OMOP on FHIR, which lets you basically take any OMOP database and lay a FHIR server on top, or lay a Smart on FHIR application on top of it. It's particularly potent for conducting population level analytics with OMOP while deploying patient level applications like clinical decision support using FHIR. So a great example would be if you wanted to build a predictive model, you probably would want to do that using something like OMOP rather than FHIR and JSON structures and things like that. It can be done, don't get me wrong, and it's been done, but using OMOP is very, very handy for something like predictive model building. But if you want to deliver guidance to a clinician or to a patient at a particular point of care, then you want to use FHIR, which is great for that patient level interoperability in the EHR. Another good use for OMOP on FHIR is to simplify ETL development. So transforming, going from EHRs to OMOP is a little bit of a hassle, I will admit. But one of the nice things is that you can go from EHR to its standard FHIR-based export, and then you can do OMOP on FHIR to be able to deliver it into OMOP format. So there's a lot of capabilities there. OMOP on FHIR has been leveraged in many projects. Red Hat OMOP as one example. We're always excited to see it used. Again, the RedCap folks, finding ways to connect these different pieces, I think, kind of coherently, but also many projects that use OMOP and use FHIR are not using, Georgia Tech's OMOP on FHIR. They've recognized that there's just inherent value to connecting these different standards. And there's been some really good work, both at foundational level and applied levels, for using OMOP on FHIR, to the point where the HL7 and Odyssey community said, we really need to establish some canonical mappings and connections between FHIR and OMOP. And this launched just this past year. The first kickoff was in August. You haven't missed anything. So if you want to jump in and start getting engaged with OMOP and FHIR through a few different working groups, one around the data models themselves, one about the vocabularies, and one around applications of these platforms, all of these things are really just kicking off. There's lots of opportunity to jump in there, but these canonical models will be extremely important. So OMOP on FHIR is a big deal for registries, and I should say the connection between OMOP and FHIR, not just the Georgia Tech OMOP on FHIR. That connection is a really big deal because the machinery to go from EHR-based FHIR resources to OMOP-based registry databases is now pre-built for any kind of standard concepts like conditions or medications or procedures. So if you have a registry where you say, did the patient, or it should say, list the patient's antibiotics that they've received, that's built in now. You can query it via FHIR, it gets transformed into OMOP, it gets written out, and it's essentially done. Now, if you need logic, which many registries do, there's some additional things that we need to do to make that happen. So let's talk a bit about NLP. And there's so much in natural language processing to discuss. I believe I saw that you've got a upcoming grand rounds that talks about natural language processing. I'm really happy to hear that because I won't be talking about it in any detail here today. There's too many things that are happening in NLP really to be a part of this talk. But I do want to talk specifically about the connections between NLP and FHIR and between NLP and OMOP, because that's really where some of the leveling up in registry generation that we're seeing now happens. So please definitely attend the follow-up grand rounds about NLP, but I want to share a little bit about how FHIR and OMOP are connecting with them. So what are the connections between NLP and OMOP? So this goes back at least some years, since 2015. The OMOP Common Data Model has included an NLP table designed specifically for representation of NLP-derived data. It's got sort of classic fields like what is the section, what's the snippet of text, are there lexical variants being pulled out, what is the concept reflected, and also has NLP kind of things like does the term exist? Is it true? Is it negated? What is the time frame? Is it historical? Is it current? Things like this are pretty classic NLP things to do with data, and OMOP makes it very easy to put those in. But there's also a very active Odyssey NLP working group led by Wazoo at UT Houston, and Hua's group is awesome, and the working group is amazing. Some of the coolest things that we've done is around cross-site note type normalization. So if you want to do a study looking at chest X-rays, well, is that CXR? Is it chest XR? Is it PA-LAT? LOINC has standards to represent those codes, but they're typically not used at different sites. So developing ways to be able to automatically identify the type of a note to handle things like abbreviations. A lot of really neat work happening with that working group. We also now see that a wide variety of clinical NLP tools have deployed connections for automated extraction to OMOP, including CTAKES and MetaMap. CLAMP is out of Houston. Clarity NLP is the one out of Georgia Tech. A lot of great NLP tools and many others that have developed connections to OMOP. So for example, with CTAKES, and this is sort of CLAMP combined, things like negation or things like hypothetical uses or things like the subject is not the patient themselves, but it's a relative, it's able to fill out this, term exists is false and put that into the OMOP database exactly as we just talked about in the field where that goes. Criteria to query, what an amazing project out of Columbia, which is just fantastic, looking at how they can take criteria from a study, automatically convert those into OMOP-based queries and pull cohorts that match those groups. Just fantastic work. And this is from Chunhua's group at Columbia. Criteria to Query has continued to do some amazing things. Clarity NLP, this is our platform out of Georgia Tech. And this is the dashboard. But what I really wanted to share was, one of the ways in which we use it, which is to take cohorts that are built in a structured form using OMOP, using Odyssey, and say, for example, in this case, we're looking for lung cancer patients who have certain diagnoses like an ICD-10 or a SNOMED concept that matches. But then we can say, well, let's get the radiology reports for those groups. In fact, let's look at chest studies for those individuals. And we're going to look at certain lesion terms, and we're going to run an algorithm called Measurement Finder, which is going to extract the measurements from those reports for lung cancer patients and then put that into a registry. And this connection between the structured and unstructured is extremely valuable. And one of the great things about, something like a Measurement Finder, like values, well, that seems kind of structured and, we can dig that up anyway, but any which way. But in fact, there's some really interesting subtleties, and I have to give props to Richard Boyd in my lab, who's done this amazing work getting the different dimensions to look at if a measurement comes out, whether it's written this by this, written as a range. It has views like 1.5 centimeter craniocaudal by 2.2 centimeter transverse, whether it's inches or millimeters, all these variations, and it will standardize it and it will structure it and it will put it into the registry. So this connection of what NLP can do, even for things that are quantitative, is really very, very potent. So OMOP has good friends in the NLP department, and we're seeing amazing work come out of there. What about FHIR? So FHIR, I think the connection between NLP and FHIR addresses one of the great barriers to using NLP in the real world. And that barrier is the need to load documents from the EHR into, for example, a SQL or NoSQL or a file structure necessary for an NLP pipeline to run. All of those great tools that I mentioned previously, you often have to load data in. You've got to have a folder of text. You have to put them in a database. You've got to load them into Solr. You have to do something like that in order to run the NLP. But the great advance provided by FHIR is that you can retrieve documents for NLP processing in a standard way, really reducing that last mile barrier to using NLP in a clinical setting. You'll be happy to know and not surprised that FHIR has a very standard document retrieval process called document reference. It's present in Epic and Cerner and OMOP on FHIR and any FHIR server you see. They'll have the ability to pull back documents. And by being able to pull these back and run them, you can then perform the really, really cool things that are enabled. There's other folks that have done really interesting work. Certainly Dr. Zhang's lab at Mayo has done really neat work between NLP and FHIR. And for example, even populating report forms registries, for example, colorectal clinical trial forms using these very same technologies, FHIR to pull the data, NLP processing to put them in. So we've talked about FHIR, we've talked about OMOP, we've talked about NLP and its connections, and I want to spend this last little section of our discussion talking about how we bring these all together. And I'll talk about how we've approached it at Georgia Tech and what themes I think that reflects more broadly. So we built something called Smart Chart in our application using these standard patterns, using FHIR, using OMOP, using NLP. And it's a platform that does registry generation, just chart abstraction with structured and unstructured data, and kind of begins with the notion of the registry form and works its way through computable queries and has a smart on FHIR app and does NLP, all the things that we've just talked about to produce results. Now, how do you how do you go through? And these are the layers, the FHIR layer. We have a logic layer using CQL and something called NLPQL. We have a standardization layer. We have a user interface and a database. It's pretty straightforward once you've been through the whole map that we've just talked about over the past 30 minutes or so. But how do you build a registry question by question to work in the ways that we've just described? And I just want to throw up a couple examples. This is a registry questions that you might see asking, for example, has a patient had a seizure? What type? Did the patient have a particular test that was done? Have they received certain therapies? This is just kind of what a registry might look like, right? It may be a series of questions, give me the dates, give me symptoms, answer these elements. So if you kind of hold the idea of there's a bunch of questions that you need to answer and think about how you might approach it. This is how we've approached it. So we establish for every question in the registry, whether there's 10 questions or 100 questions, some number from 0 to n evidence bundles. And I say 0 because there's some questions where, and we'll talk more about this in a sec, it's not, the computer is not the best way to answer the question. But we establish these evidence bundles, and each one of those bundles has a series of features that can be made up of structured or unstructured queries. And those features could be considered informational, for example, something relevant to the user, but perhaps not an answer itself, or they could be part of the answer logic, where the answer is derived from the feature. So for example, if the question is, has the patient had a stroke? You might want to share something like, they've had a head CT done, or they had a headache, and that would be informational, it would be relevant, but it doesn't answer the question, did they have a stroke or not? Where if you do have something like the mention of an infarct, that's current on a head CT, or you have a coded diagnosis of a cerebrovascular accident, that would be part of the answer logic. That would be saying, yes, I think I can assert that they did have such an event. And so you can see an example here, and this is in the Smart Chart application, the sort of user perspective, where over to the right are mentions that are taken from the clinical notes regarding, and from radiology reports regarding the presence of a stroke or of a CVA in this particular individual. And if it fits within the index timeframe that you're looking for, you can make an assertion of, yes, this patient did have a stroke, and whether that's modified by a user is certainly flexible and up to them. And sometimes you might not want to make an assertion. Sometimes you just might want to say, I'm going to show you some relevant data, but I don't think this is appropriate for the computer to make an assertion without human review. Here's another example looking at more structured coded data where we're looking at platelet counts. And so, for example, were platelets greater than 20? And so we can see there's both unstructured mentions of platelets. Everybody is probably familiar that doctors might write out the platelet count, PLT, 500, whatever it may be, 320. But you also will have structured data, LOINC encoded values, and you want to be able to share both sets of information to the user in an easy way to see that. And all of this is happening because the evidence bundle around this platelet question goes out and it says, get me structured data on platelets over a certain level. Get me unstructured data on platelets over a certain level. And so we're utilizing a CQL to define platelet representations in LOINC, values, and so forth. We're using NLPQL, which is how the Clarity NLP platform defines things. Again, looking for things like platelets, assigning values. And again, NLP gives you a couple neat things that you can do, like if you're looking for ranges or you're looking for units, or if the author of the note used a space or a dash or a colon or an equal, or even text, you can pull all those together. And these are just handy NLP things you can do. Or for example, if you're looking for a value extraction, like the New York Heart Association, and maybe level 3 and 4, but you need the Roman numerals 3 and 4. Again, that's something where it's quite handy to have NLP, even if you might be able to pull this from a structured source. So this is just an example of what those data might be looking like. If the question is fevers, you may wish to show temperature values over a certain level. You may wish to show mentions of fevers in a note. If the question is about seizure, in this case, we can see that there's evidence bundles around seizure, but it has specifically around type. And so we identify there's a tonic-clonic seizure, which enables us to support the registry creation by putting in this is a tonic-clonic seizure based on what's found in the data. It can always be changed by the user, or you could choose not to autocomplete that if that's something that you want to just present but not act on or assert. But here's an example of a question that's actually kind of hard for a computer compared to a person. Specify the recipient's survival status at the date of last contact. Are they alive or are they dead? Well, I think a person is probably much better at determining if somebody is alive or dead than a computer. It's got a lot of work to do to make that assertion. And so what we do for every registry and for all the questions within a registry is we look at each question and we assess what would be the difficulty for a clinical expert to go through this and what would be the difficulty for the NLP platform to do it. You could imagine if you have to search through hundreds of documents to find a CT that has a mention of a cyst, well, that's a lot easier for a computer to do with NLP. It takes a lot of time for a person to do. But if you have to do some complex assessment or even just something determining is somebody alive or dead, which is quite quick for a person to do, then maybe the ratio is in favor of a clinical expert doing that. And so we're able to prioritize and decide what sort of ways we're going to approach a registry by looking and balancing this relevant difference between the clinical expert and the system. Now, if you do make an assertion, such as in this case, did the mother use illicit opioids? And we find, yes, there's evidence of intrauterine heroin use. Well, the answer to the question may be yes, but you also want to reflect and keep the underlying data from which it was derived. And this is an important theme that we try to advance throughout this work. So when we store data and answers to question OMOP, and this I think is a neurologic manifestations question related to syphilis, we want to store the answer in a structured form where yes and no follow the guidance. In this case, there's a SNOMED value set that should be utilized. But we also want to retain the source data from which the answer was derived, such as, tabes dorsalis is the diagnosis. We want to keep that, but that's not a yes or a no. That's a relevant data point that should be captured. So every registry answer in our system that we use in OMOP, we store an observation as well as one-to-N linked source data elements like conditions, medications, other observations from which the answer was derived. So tabes dorsalis is in there, as well as the answer yes to the question about neurologic manifestations. This allows the user both to drill down and allows the registry question to remain bespoke, to remain custom and very specific while still enabling the use of OMOP's standards-based analytic tools like cohort generation. So you could still query your database for patients who had a certain set of standard codes and conditions, but you also keep the very custom registry question that was designed for this particular registry. So in conclusion, registry generation remains a key challenge, but also an opportunity in medical informatics. The solidification of FHIR and OMOP standards simplify many of the decisions now in registry creation and patient data abstraction. They've handed us so much to work from. And this growing bridge between clinical NLP and the FHIR and OMOP standards provides many opportunities for innovation in creating smarter and interoperable registries for a wide range of use cases. So I want to thank you all very much for your time and your attention. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
So much for that wonderful presentation. I agree wholeheartedly with that message. One of the things I think is fascinating about combining NLP to registries is this idea that we're now going to need to have a lot more provenance. How did you get that measure? There might have been 10 measures of that value for platelets. There could have been 3 note mentions and 7 in coded data. But this way, I'm hoping with the NLP, we can actually track the provenance and saying, if we want to review how a computer or a human went and try to make a decision, we can kind of refer back to how it came from the source data.
Yeah, that's a great point, Paul. And you've telegraphed what much of the discussion in some of the OMOP FHIR groups was about provenance and how to really maintain it. It's a very, very high area of interest. I see some questions and comments here. I don't know the best way to go through. If you guys have a particular approach I should follow.
Yeah, feel free to pick with the question you like. Chris or Harold, if you'd like to ask a question as well, you're welcome to.
Just note that there are questions both in Q&A and in the chat, just to make your life interesting.
And for the record, John, I just want to say this was spectacular. I've been following your work for years, and I'm deeply impressed. And you're singing my song, so to speak. So I'm delighted.
Thank you so much, Chris, and for your leadership in this. So many of the things that are happening here. Obviously, your name is attached to so many of these pieces, and I'm excited to be able to work together at this, really, really critical opportunity. It's a great junction.
I certainly resonate with you condensing the message of taking population level evidence from OMOP, where you need to have a longitudinal record, where you want to bring a lot of data together and you want to analyze and create evidence, and then using that with FHIR for patient level clinical decision support. So I find that's a great way of combining and sharing why those two standards really have a lot of complementary components to each other.
Well, I see quite a few questions in here. I try to just grab a few
Yep.
from the list if we can. And again, really appreciate the comments and absolutely echo Chris's comments about, this is a great time for this work. So one question from Siegfried comes around, does the addition of USCDI semantic standard to the FHIR syntactic standard sufficient to give confidence in the interoperability or commensurability of data gathered in separate EHRs without specific coordination? So I think maybe this question is about, even if there's a common standard for how things come out, might different EHRs still, capture data differently? The doctors, the way that the workflow in that system is in place, lead people to code things differently. And I think that's a fair case, and I think it's always been true, but at least we have the ability to study that now. And I think that's the difference, right? I think the ability to have a standard output format lets us look at the variations in terms of a given patient population and how they may be represented in different ways across systems. So it doesn't solve it, but I think it lets us kind of look at that question more carefully. How does NLP, OMOP, and FHIR work with registries that reside within EMR, such as Epic-supported registries? I don't have as much experience specifically with embedded registries. Certainly, Epic and Cerner and all the rest have ways to support smart applications, which let you do some of the kinds of things I was showing before. If it's embedded within Epic, maybe someone else here might know more, Paul or Chris, or about how you can pull those data in.
That's just more of a local collection within a health system of that data. It's not usually aggregated across multiple systems from what I've seen. So it doesn't, but and often it doesn't have. I haven't seen NLP components to it yet, but certainly it would be great if it was able to take some of these open source tools using open standards like FHIR to be able to plug in these NLP tools right into the EMR workflow. It might be useful. I don't know if you want to describe the CDC project where we're trying to integrate the FHIR, OMOP, and NLP into clinical workflow. That could be a good segue.
Absolutely. So really excited to work with Paul and the folks up at Hopkins around a CDC project, which is related to sexually transmitted disease, in particular this focus on syphilis. You may not realize that actually STDs is by far the most dominant flow of data for public health reporting is around STDs. And so we're working on a syphilis registry project to gather information that really incorporates both diagnosis, treatments, tests, symptoms, things that require structured and unstructured data. And we're really excited about the opportunity to work with Paul and his team because it uses the pieces of FHIR to pull data out, can pull it from an OMOP-based FHIR or a native FHIR engine, to run logic through NLP, and to put it into OMOP exactly in the ways that we described here so that the registry is created and then viewable as this OMOP-based registry in a standard form. It uses all the pieces that we've described here. And I think the real opportunity is how can we help health departments get the data that they need from health systems in a way that is specific and it doesn't overreach in terms of the data that they're pulling out. They have to be very careful and sensitive to the fact that if they're looking at whether it's diabetes or syphilis, they only should be pulling data on those topics. But at the same time, they have a complicated set of information to retrieve. And so the goal of this project is over the next couple of years to be able to set up, evaluate both the retrieval and abstraction process, as well as the connection to public health so that they can get the information that they need through this streamlined mechanism. So it's a really exciting, and the CDC is super excited about it. And the opportunity to work with Paul is also a great one for us. So.
And I suppose, I don't know how we'd embed it directly within the EMR registry systems, but it'd be easy to bring this knowledge back into an EMR using CDS hooks or other decision support integration methods within an EMR where people could do a call out with information and they could query the OMOP database and be able to return back a predictor or guidelines around that, or initiate the NLP to really investigate that person's chart to see if they can extract data for a particular registry.
I'll address this question here. How do you prioritize discordant, unstructured, and structured data? Because that's a general issue, which of course a manual chart reviewer has to deal with it as well. You know, finding something here and finding something there. How do you do it in a way that you're trying to apply the logic? There's two ways to do it. One is to punt, where you say, we're just going to show this information, and here's the structured, and here's the unstructured. We hope we've saved you some time, but we're not going to make the call. So you kind of punt on it, and you just show that it's relevant. I think in other cases, if you need to preserve, what you want to do is just ensure that you're preserving the source data, and that if there's something that might be, generally speaking, the structured data, I would lean on as being like more likely you got it correct than perhaps the unstructured, where there may be something that is saying, you know, there's a negation that wasn't picked up correctly. So if you really have clearly discordant data, it probably would lean towards the structured data in that context. Well, I mean, there's too many interesting questions. I want, you know, there's NLP-based questions, things like separating stroke from rule out stroke. Chris and others could talk about that. I mean, things have gotten pretty good about removing some of these hypotheticals, but I think the fundamental question here is NLP is still imperfect. Selection of codes is still imperfect. When we build code sets and value sets, we still sometimes miss some key elements. And there's some really, really valuable tools that are in the Odyssey framework, where you can look at what are the relative counts of codes for individuals who made it into a cohort. And you can identify, you know, what are common codes, what are left out for people who look like these people, but were not part of your code set. And so there's all kinds of things that I think can be done at scale to find the deficits in phenotype creation, which is, you know, it's a challenge and one that we just have to keep working on to improve.
That was a wonderful presentation and discussion. I want to thank you so much. I'm also really excited because one of the things I see of this potential, there's real value when you combine FHIR and OMOP with NLP. There's real value for within a health system. This can be much more than just supporting our registry. This could be supporting QI initiatives. This can be supporting quality measures. This can certainly help improve efficiency. I want to take my 70 chart abstractors, and they put so much energy into data collection, and we need to put more energy into actually using that information to doing root cause analysis and to re-engineering systems based upon that data. So I find that there's really just a lot of improvement we can do once we have tools that can help us collect this data in a more systematic fashion. So I find that there's going to be enormous potentials for this, for creating value within health systems, for supporting registries, and even conducting clinical trials. So this is I hopefully see this pattern get replicated, and we are able to scale upon these types of technologies. So thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And with that, I would like to close our grand rounds.
Thank you all very much.
That's great.
Have a good day.
Yep. Thank you so much.